Welcome back. The attack on a stadium in Manchester hit as teenage fans were streaming onto the street. 22 people were killed, many children, and nearly 60 people were wounded. Health officials say some victims walked themselves to nearby hospitals, while others face critical injuries. Well, let's bring in our chief medical correspondent, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Great to have you with us. Just explain for us the sort of injuries that some of these people would be experiencing right now, and whether children are more susceptible to this.
You know, we used to talk about these as being just battlefield injuries, but over the last 5 years, you know, civilian hospitals have started to see more and more of these explosive injuries, so they become pretty defined, sadly. There's sort of three waves of injuries. The first wave is the blast itself. So there's just a force from the blast. It's what people heard. It's what people felt, even quite a distance away. The second wave of injury, if you will, is basically everything, shrapnel, everything starts to move within that wave. Anything can become shrapnel, glass, things that are lying on the ground, whatever. That's the second wave. And the third wave is when people are actually moving into other people. So the bodies themselves start to move. It's tough to talk about, but that's what happens. Children are more susceptible to the extent that oftentimes, depending on where the explosion occurred, sometimes they may be closer to the source of the explosion. And then obviously, you know, they can be very resilient in terms of how they cope for medical injuries. But with these significant injuries like this on a smaller body, without going into too much detail, is going to have a greater impact.
Yeah, 22 dead, many of them children, 59 wounded. But apart from the physical injuries, there's going to be a lot of psychological trauma here, isn't there?
There's no question. You know, I have three girls aged 8, 10, and 12, and they were asking me about this right away. They wanted to know. I mean, it just strikes home. And I think, you know, as you've talked about, as so many people have talked about, the psychology of terror really is of a couple things. It's not so much about terror as it is vulnerability. You're vulnerable. And that vulnerability is really what strikes at the heart of terror. And the second thing really is a concert like this, in the quote-unquote biggest soft target one could have imagined, it makes the feeling that no one is immune. And that is the other ingredient, really, when we talk about terror. Vulnerability, no one is immune, and children are going to be particularly susceptible to this sort of thing, even outside the fact that it was at a Ariana Grande concert.
Yeah, I mean, one of the mothers speaking to one of my colleagues earlier today was saying her daughter is just crying all day, saying, I don't want to go back to school. What happens if it's targeted there? What happens if there's an attack there? So this is going to be a long-term rehabilitation for a lot of these young people.
It is, and I'll tell you one thing that really struck me in the years now of covering these sorts of stories is that if you're trying to think about what's the best thing you can do as a parent or as a community, it's really these first couple of nights in particular. And in fact, one of the greatest predictors of recovery is sleep. So making sure you get adequate sleep. It sounds so simple, but for adults and particularly for children, those first couple nights, making sure that the sleep comes it's an insulator. It's not going to be protective, but it's an insulator.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Just looking at some of the physical injuries now, 8 hospitals had to try and deal with the aftermath of this and are still working hard on a lot of these poor children that are suffering life-threatening injuries. How do they cope in a situation like this? Just explain what happens.
Well, this is it's a fairly good-sized city. It's obviously, that's better in terms of trauma relief and all that sort of stuff. They have a lot of communication that goes on pretty quickly in terms of which patients are going to go to which hospitals, what they have the capacity for. I find that typically, whether it's here in the States or in the UK, wherever it may be, there's an all-hands-on-deck sort of approach, Linda. I mean, people who aren't even on call start to arrive, nurses, doctors, everybody. So there's very much a galvanizing. One thing I will say is that with these types of explosions is that there's probably a significant, not insignificant number of people who may actually still need hospitalization and may not know it yet. When an explosion like this, anything that's air-filled space within your body, your lungs, for example, you can have small injuries that at the time you may not recognize, but they can grow in size. So that's another thing the hospitals have to keep in mind, is that there may be another group of patients coming in over the next several hours or a day or so.
Yeah, that's a good point. And of course, we think about the people that were in the arena at the time, but I imagine emergency services and people like that dealing with the aftermath of this must also suffer from the trauma of witnessing this sort of an attack.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, that we always say that there's no adequate training for something quite like this, especially, again, when it comes to children. So they're dealing with that, many of them parents themselves, and maybe even in a community that's big, but still everyone kind of knows each other. did you know people? Did you have your friends kids who you may know? And then there's also the very practical concern of they themselves and their safety. Is there another attack coming? Could they be subjected to an attack even as they are the first responders and rescuers? We hear about that sort of thing happening in other parts of the world. Could that sort of barbaric, evil behavior also be taking place in Manchester?
Yeah, and no doubt that goes through your mind as you're rushing to the scene.
Right, right.
All right, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, always a pleasure having you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that insight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, the memorials to the victims of the Manchester attack are now growing. Coming up after the break, we'll look at the effect this terror attack is having on the community a little bit more and how they might be able to heal.